Leading stories, trending topics, changing narratives. You're listening to the Critical Conversations Podcast.
That's right. Welcome back to the Critical Conversations Podcast, everyone. My name is Dr. Rick Daniels, and I am the Director of Institutional Equity and Inclusion here at Oakton College. Thanks for being with me again today. I got a question for you. How are you doing? No, seriously. Really, how are you doing? Look, I know we can't go back and forth. It's obviously a recorded podcast, but I think that's a question that really deserves a little bit more time than people typically give it. I know I don't. I don't know about you, but when I ask, how are you doing? I typically mean it as a greeting and not necessarily as a question. And so when people actually go into their honest thoughts about how they're doing, sometimes I think to myself, well, I didn't ask you all of that. And then I have to check myself and say, actually, you did. So lean in. And so today, I hope you lean in for just a moment and consider the question, how are you doing? The reason why that question is important is because we are living in some very difficult times, particularly if you are practitioners of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It's clear that there's a full-on frontal assault on the work that we do and also the people that we do it for. And so today, I hope that this episode encourages you and not discourages you. But buckle your seatbelt, because some of the things that we're going to cover in the next few moments are potentially triggering. The title of today's episode is Resilience in the Face of Opposition: Navigating the Latest Dear Colleague Letter. Today, we want to dive into the most recent Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education. This letter explains and reiterates existing legal requirements under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, and other relevant authorities. So today, what we're going to do is go through 3 quotes. I'm going to try to unpack those quotes. We'll tell you what the letter instructs people to do, and then I'm going to try to end by providing what I believe are some hopeful tips for how to stay resilient in these times. Let's get started. So first, this letter was issued by the Department of Education, and it makes clear that the current administration's position against diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, particularly when they're tied to admissions, hiring, and policies that prioritize racial equity, is under attack. This marks a significant shift in the conversation about equity, with potential consequences for how institutions foster inclusive environments. So let's go through 3 quotes that I think that you should all pay attention to in this letter. Now, there are many, okay? And trust me, it was hard to narrow it down to 3. But here are the ones that I think that you should be paying attention to. Quote number 1, educational institutions have toxically indoctrinated students with the false premise that the United States is built upon systemic and structural racism and advanced discriminatory policies and practices. This quote reflects a viewpoint that challenges the idea that systemic and structural racism is foundational to the United States. It frames educational institutions as promoting a toxic and false narrative, implying that discussions of systemic racism are both harmful and inaccurate. The use of strong language like toxically indoctrinated suggests a belief that these teachings are not just incorrect, but also damaging. But the counter argument is that systemic and structural racism are well-defined realities in history and also in present day. Scholars across disciplines, including history, sociology, law, they all provide extensive evidence of how policies and institutions such as housing, education, criminal justice, and healthcare have historically disadvantaged marginalized groups, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Let's go to quote number 2. The letter states that DEI programs frequently preference certain racial groups and teach students that certain racial groups bear unique moral burdens that others do not. Such programs stigmatize students who belong to particular racial groups based on crude racial stereotypes. All right, let's break this one down. This quote argues that DEI programs favor certain racial groups over others and suggests that programs rely on stereotypes, which leads to the stigmatization of specific racial groups. The use of terms like preference, and stigmatize implies that DEI programs create reverse discrimination and reinforce negative assumptions about identity, ultimately reinforcing that narrative. But I believe that reverse discrimination is an interesting term, because if you can acknowledge that it is in reverse, then you can acknowledge also the original direction that it was intended in the first place. You see, I don't believe that DEI promotes stereotypes. I believe that this work speaks to the complexity of identity and structural forces behind inequities that exist within the educational system. And so acknowledging those disparities and promoting a shared responsibility is not just about fairness. It's a necessary step toward dismantling the systemic barriers and empowering all students and employees to succeed. The last quote simply provides 3 instructions for educational practitioners. Here they are. Number 1, ensure that policies and actions comply with existing civil rights law. Number 2, cease all efforts to circumvent prohibitions on the use of race by relying on proxies or other indirect means to establish such ends. In other words, don't try to get around this. And number 3, cease all reliance on third-party contractors, clearinghouses, or aggregators that are being used by institutions in an effort to circumvent prohibited uses of race. In other words, don't hire anyone else. Don't contract out. Forget about that training that you had planned. You see, these instructions may not necessarily be clear, but they are direct. And so we encourage you to really take a look at how it impacts your institution or organization. Okay, I know that was a lot. So take a second, pause, and breathe. Look, despite this pushback, we must continue advocating for policies and practices that lift up all voices. Resilience in this work isn't just about surviving. It's about creating a future where equity is truly realized. And resilience has always been the fuel that drives equity work. So here are 3 ways to stay resilient in this work. Strategy number 1, be prepared. The work we do in DEI is rooted in justice and humanity. So in light of this letter, it's essential for us to reconnect with our core purpose. Equity is not a trend. It's a moral imperative. And even when the policies try to diminish it, your commitment to fairness must remain steadfast. However, institutions should be prepared to make changes that uphold the integrity of the work rather than shifting the focus away from it. That includes reviewing your diversity statements or considering how you institutionalize grant-funded programs so that they won't be cut. You can even look deeper into the curriculum and training for employees to understand the ways in which we can continue to help people see themselves as leaders and participants in this work. But be prepared. Number 2, advocate for the value of this work with both data and stories. In times of policy resistance like this, we have to equip ourselves with data that shows the tangible benefits of this work. The evidence is clear that diverse institutions aren't just more inclusive, they drive greater innovation, performance, and long-term success. So we have to let our facts speak louder than the opposition's. And number 3, lead with questions to drive change. One of the most powerful ways to foster equity work is to consistently lead with thoughtful questions. Instead of always being expected to have the answers, we can also start by asking questions. Questions like, how do our policies impact marginalized groups? What barriers exist that prevent equal access to opportunities for everyone? How can we empower individuals at all levels to take ownership of equity initiatives? You see, this approach encourages deep reflection and creates space for diverse perspectives. It also ensures that solutions are grounded in real experiences that affect people each and every day. Questioning should be a central piece of your work because it invites collaboration, it challenges assumptions, and it continuously helps us to refine our approach. Listen, as I stated before, I know that this is a lot. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot for me, and I chose this profession intentionally. But no matter how you got here, we are all responsible for the work that must be done to safeguard the work that must be done. I'm going to end with a quote from the great Malcolm X. who said famously, education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope this session has given you an understanding of the Dear Colleague letter, but also empowered you with some actionable strategies to stay resilient in the face of opposition. Take care.
The Critical Conversations podcast is recorded at Oakton College, located at 1600 East Gulf Road, Des Plaines, Illinois. The show is sponsored in part by the Oakton College Educational Foundation, produced by Erick Rohn, coordinated by Brenda Cruz, and hosted by Dr. Rick Daniels. For more information or to connect with us, email critconpod@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for more Critical Conversations.